New video from the Navy shows what may be the future of modern close-in warfare. It's their new laser gun, which is shown hitting targets on ships at sea and shooting a drone out of the...
For the first time in history, the U.S. Navy has confirmed the existence of a weapon so advanced they admit nothing on Earth can stop it. But this revelation wasn't meant for public ears. It slipped into daylight through a statement, so carefully worded, it raised more questions than it answered. Now the world is left staring into the shadows, wondering not just what this unstoppable creation is, but why the Navy chose to speak of it now. What's coming next? It began with a single paragraph, just a few lines buried deep in a dense technical statement released by the Navy. On the surface, looked like routine military jargon, references to operational readiness, advanced systems integration, and strategic deterrence. But one sentence stopped reporters. Cold. It was the kind of phrase that didn't belong in any public document, the kind that normally lived and died behind classified seals. The system has been successfully tested and demonstrated to be incapable of interception by any known countermeasure within hours. That single sentence had slipped beyond the sterile walls of the Pentagon press office and into the bloodstream of the media. The initial reaction was confusion. Some thought it was a mistranslation of military speak. Others assumed it was an exaggeration from a journalist desperate for a headline. But the wording was clear, deliberate, and unflinching. No known countermeasure. Unstoppable. That morning, Pentagon's secure press briefing room was colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Journalists sat in tightly packed rows, eyes darting between their devices and the closed double doors at the far end. Every few minutes, a low murmur rose and fell as someone whispered a theory hypersonic missile. Quantum AI, some next-gen railgun project. Then the doors opened. The man who stepped inside was not a PR officer or mid-level spokesman. It was Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale, a man whose career was built in the shadows rarely seen on camera. His uniform was immaculate, the rows of ribbons on his chest gleaming under the lights, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the precision of someone trained to notice everything. He didn't smile. He didn't warm the audience up. He just began speaking. For the next 20 minutes, Hale spoke in a voice as steady as an aircraft carrier at anchor, spoke of progress, of technological leaps, of capabilities previously confined to theory. But with each sentence, there was something else, a careful restraint. As if he were walking a narrow bridge between telling the public enough and revealing far too much. Weeks earlier, none of this seemed possible. A development came from obscure corners of the defense world. There had been unexplained nighttime maneuvers off the coast of Guam, ships moving in tight, erratic formations, vanishing from civilian radar entirely. In the Atlantic, an exercise was abruptly canceled, replaced with a classified operations drill that spanned 5 days and involved vessels from 3 different fleets. Then there were the procurement anomalies, contracts issued to companies nobody had heard of. Shell corporations with generic names like Apex Systems Integration and Mariner Technologies LLC. On paper, they were buying non-standard propulsion components and field-stabilized containment arrays. To the trained eye, those phrases hinted at something unprecedented. Rumors bled out from the lower decks, too. Sailors at Norfolk told of cargo loaded under armed guard, even the loading crews blindfolded until the job was done. One petty officer claimed he saw a shipping manifest labeled with the code name Aquila.
What?
But the document vanished from the ship's logs hours later. And then there was the intercepted transmission, unverified, between 2 high-ranking officers speaking of deployment timelines and containment procedures. Hale never named the weapon during that briefing. He didn't have to. It was in the way he avoided certain questions, the way his answers tightened when reporters asked about deployment locations or potential adversaries. When pressed, he only repeated the same phrase. The system has been tested. The system has been proven. The system will not fail. The air in the room shifted then, a subtle tightening of chests and a prickling awareness along the spine. Somewhere between the lines, everyone in that press room knew what was being said. Something had been built that changed the rules entirely. And yet, as quickly as the Admiral had arrived, he was gone. He left without handshakes, without lingering for follow-up questions. The double doors shut behind him, and the hum of speculation exploded in the room. Cameras clicked, reporters spoke into phones, editors shouted for rewrites. Outside that room, in the cool corridors of the Pentagon, Hale walked away flanked by two aides carrying locked briefcases. Somewhere deep inside that building was the full story, a story the public was never meant to hear. But by the end of that day, the Navy's statement had already traveled far beyond the walls of Washington. It was being dissected in foreign military think tanks, debated on late-night talk shows, and whispered about in encrypted chat rooms. Whatever this system was, the world now knew one thing for certain. It was real. It could not be stopped. And then, without warning, the Navy spoke again this time. Not through leaked documents or carefully controlled briefings, but in a public announcement broadcast worldwide. This was the moment they stopped hinting and started telling. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale didn't waste time with pleasantries. When the broadcast light went red and the feed began streaming across national networks, he leaned forward into the podium and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 100 classified briefings. The United States Navy has successfully completed the deployment phase of a defense system, he said, that is impervious to interception by any known or projected countermeasure. The sentence landed like a detonation. It's not theoretical. Not in development. Deployed. The phrasing was calculated. It's measured to the millimeter. But there was no mistaking the magnitude of what he was claiming. He didn't name it. He didn't call it a weapon. Instead, he wrapped it in layers of technical language, a strategic deterrent platform, a multi-domain rapid engagement asset, nonlinear kinematic operational capability. To most viewers, it was opaque, even meaningless. But to anyone versed in the language of defense, contracts, and military technology, it was clear this was no mere upgrade. This was a paradigm shift. The footage cut between Hale's face and the press pool reporter's frozen mid-note, some blinking in disbelief, and then, almost as if scripted, the networks began to pull archival clips to frame the gravity of the moment. Black and white reels of the first stealth fighter, the F-117, rolled across screens, a plane so invisible to radar that, when first revealed, military analysts swore the Pentagon was bluffing. Then came the grainy 1960s film of the first nuclear-powered submarine sliding silently into the ocean, a weapon system that rewrote naval warfare overnight. But this was different. The Admiral wasn't talking about a weapon that could be countered with enough time and money. He was describing something that, by his own words, could not be stopped by anyone. It has no peer in the known battle space, Hal continued, and no adversary possesses the means to prevent its arrival or neutralize its effects once initiated. The phrase "once initiated" sent a tremor through the audience. Exactly was being initiated. In the hours that followed, leaked descriptions began to circulate. None were official, and every source claimed to have seen a different aspect of the system, but patterns emerged. One source from Naval Air Systems Command hinted at an airframe unlike any in service, able to sustain speeds and maneuvering profiles. Considered aerodynamically impossible, another described a hull configuration that seemed more suited to surviving the crushing depths of the Mariana Trench than to cutting through the open sea. Then there were the whispers about the power source rumors, that it didn't rely on conventional fuel or even nuclear fission. Instead, some insiders spoke of field stability generators and plasma confinement rings. Phrases more at home in speculative physics papers than in an operational Navy project. Skeptics scoffed, calling it science fiction. But even the scoffing couldn't disguise the unease. A single image began to spread online, a grainy, slow light still from what appeared to be a shipboard hangar. In the background, a towering, curved structure loomed, its surface lined with hexagonal panels that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the dim light. No one could confirm its authenticity, but the photo was unlike anything in the public catalog. Of military hardware? It wasn't a missile. It wasn't a plane. It looked alien. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering fragments of procurement documents requests for high-density superconducting composites and thermal nullification plating.
A former defense contractor claimed that some of these components didn't
just deflect heat or radar, they absorbed it, rendering the system undetectable even at point-blank range. If true, it would mean that by the time you saw it, it had already completed its mission. Then came the most startling twist. This wasn't a future rollout. According to one investigative piece, the technology had already been deployed in limited capacity, not in controlled tests, but in live operations. A maritime incident in the South China Sea last year, officially blamed on navigational failure, suddenly looked different in the new light. An entire destroyer group reportedly detected an inbound threat, scrambled countermeasures, and nothing worked. Moments later, the threat simply vanished from sensors, leaving no trace. The Navy never explained it. Now some were suggesting they didn't have to. Still, for all the speculation, there was no concrete admission of what the system could do. Was it an offensive platform capable of destroying fleets? A defensive shield? A reconnaissance craft? Every theory seemed plausible, and that uncertainty only deepened the intrigue. Operational secrecy is paramount, Hale said when pressed. Its existence is now public knowledge. Specifics are not. But the specifics had a way of leaking even in fragments. One defense blogger claimed to have obtained a schematic-can exploded view diagram of a cylindrical core, flanked by curved fins that folded into a near-perfect teardrop shape. The blogger insisted it came from inside the Naval Research Laboratory, though the post vanished within hours, replaced by a vague content-removed notice. And then, buried in a separate investigation, came the reference that would ignite an entirely new wave of speculation, an unfiled patent. It had never entered the public registry, yet it was mentioned in an internal Navy memo as a foundational component of Project Aquila. The name attached to it was instantly polarizing: Dr. Salvatore Pais, a controversial Navy scientist, whose previous patents included claims of a room-temperature superconductor and a craft using an inertial mass reduction device. His work had long been dismissed as fringe even within military circles. But now, if the whispers were true, one of his impossible designs wasn't just real, it was operational. And if Pais was right, it wasn't just unstoppable. It was untouchable. Retired Rear Admiral Thomas Vance didn't hesitate when asked what an unstoppable weapon meant for global strategy. "You're looking at the end of deterrence as we know it," he said flatly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades at sea. Every defense plan in existence assumes there's some countermeasure, some fallback. If that's gone, then the only defense is not making enemies in the first place. And history shows we're not very good at that. Defense analysts across the board echoed the same unease. Dr. Elena Kuryanova, former Rand Corporation strategist, put it more starkly. The Cold War was stable precisely because both sides could destroy each other. The grim balance mutually assured destruction, kept fingers off the trigger. But if one side has a weapon that can strike with impunity, the entire game board tilts. The weaker side has two options: surrender or strike first. Naval engineers, when coaxed into speculation, struggled to even articulate the physics. "Look, if what they're saying is true, it violates known aerodynamic limitations," said Miguel Harada, a propulsion specialist who worked on the Navy's next-gen destroyers. "You can't just accelerate something that fast without cooking it in its own atmospheric friction. Unless," he hesitated, "unless you've figured out how to create a localized energy field that makes the air behave differently. That's not supposed to be possible outside of a lab then, even then, only for milliseconds." Others took a different angle. Dr. Leonard Preto, an expert in materials science, suggested that what seemed like impossible speed might instead be impossible invisibility. If it can mask its thermal and radar profile, you might not even detect it until it's past you, he said. And that's the terrifying part. You can't stop what you can't see. Not everyone was convinced. Some suspected the announcement was more psychological than physical. This could be strategic theater, warned Kate Ramiro, a former CIA deception analyst. You float the idea of an unstoppable weapon, and suddenly your adversaries second-guess every move. They delay their own plans, shift resources, maybe even overreact in ways that hurt themselves. Disinformation has always been cheaper than deployment. But then there were the eyewitness accounts, too specific, too strange to dismiss entirely. A sailor from the USS Chancellorsville, speaking under condition of anonymity, described a night exercise off the coast of Guam. We saw something cut across the horizon. No sound, no radar signature, just gone in a blink. The wake it left behind didn't even behave right. It was like the water folded back in on itself. Another described a similar sighting near the test ranges at Point Mugu. It wasn't flying, not like a plane. More like it was skipping between places. Internationally, the ripples were immediate. Within 48 hours of Hale's announcement, satellite imagery revealed unusual activity at a Chinese naval facility in high-known ships being loaded with unfamiliar sensor arrays, as if preparing to hunt something that didn't want to be. Found in Russia, state media pivoted abruptly to coverage of hypersonic deterrent programs, a move analysts read as both a public reassurance and a signal to Washington. And in Europe, NATO quietly convened a closed-door session on asymmetric maritime threats. The reactions were telling, but it was the tone that betrayed the real anxiety. This wasn't the bluster of confident nations. It was the scrambling of players who feared the rules had just changed mid-game. Still, skepticism persisted in some quarters. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, cautioned astrophysicist and defense consultant Dr. Peter Halvorsen. If this thing exists, the physics are so far beyond our current public understanding that it would represent a leap on par with the invention of the atomic bomb. Those kinds of leaps don't happen in secret, unless we've been looking in entirely the wrong place for progress. And then there was the whisper. In the middle of an off-record conversation, one senior defense researcher who had been walking me through the technical improbabilities leaned in. The room went quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. "If this is real," he said, glancing toward the closed door, "it's not designed for defense." Some swore it had to be a next-generation hypersonic drone swarm. Not a single weapon, but hundreds, maybe thousands of autonomous craft. Moving so fast, they'd be little more than blurs against the sky. The logic was seductive. A missile defense system could intercept one or two incoming threats, maybe even a handful, but not a cloud of them approaching at Mach 10, analysts imagined. These drones, as self-organizing predators, communicating in milliseconds, changing trajectories in perfect synchrony. Think of it like a flock of starlings, said one aerospace blogger, except each one can carry enough firepower to sink a carrier. The terrifying part wasn't just the speed, it was the scale. If even a fraction slipped through, the damage would be catastrophic. And at those velocities, slipping through wasn't a maybe, it was inevitable. Then there was the electromagnetic propulsion theory, whispered about in late-night defense forums and dismissed just as quickly by mainstream engineers. This one felt like it belonged in a classified binder stamped with bold red letters. Breaks known physics. The idea was simple in concept. It's impossible in execution. Use electromagnetic fields to accelerate a craft without moving parts, without fuel in the traditional sense, without friction slowing it down. A ship or, perhaps, a plane gliding on a cushion of magnetism, skipping past the drag and heat that shredded other high-speed prototypes. Some drew diagrams showing glowing plasma, envelopes. Others connected the dots to bizarre reports of gravity field manipulation buried deep in fringe technical journals. It was the kind of technology that, if real, didn't just change warfare, it rewrote the rules of transportation, energy, and space travel. A darker theory gained traction in certain circles, that the unstoppable weapon wasn't a projectile at all, but an energy system, something capable of disabling electronics over an entire continent in seconds. An electromagnetic pulse on a scale humanity had never seen. In that scenario, there's no explosion, no shockwave, just silence. Fighter jets fall from the sky. Ships drift powerless at sea. Satellites blink out. It's the nightmare of... The modern military warned a cybersecurity officer, "We've built our entire defense strategy on a digital nervous system. Cut that, and the whole body goes limp." The irony. A weapon like that wouldn't need to fire on an enemy too. Control them. It would simply hold the threat over their heads. A sort of Damocles powered not by steel, but by invisible force. And yet maybe it was all smoke and mirrors. A psyop, an invented concept, deliberately vague, designed to plant a seed of fear in every foreign military briefing room. No prototype, no factory, no operational system, just an idea. After all, military history is filled with ghosts. The doomsday device rumors during the Cold War, the phantom fleets whispered about in World War II, invisible bombers supposedly patrolling the skies before stealth technology actually existed. As one intelligence historian put it, sometimes the threat you can't confirm is the most powerful weapon of all. This theory painted the Navy's announcement not as a slip, but as a chess move forcing rivals to spend billions chasing a phantom. Whatever the truth, one name kept surfacing in the speculative tide. Dr. Salvatore Pais, a Navy aerospace engineer with a portfolio of patents that read like rejected science fiction plotlines, high-energy electromagnetic field generator, piezoelectricity-induced room-temperature superconductor craft, using an inertial mass reduction device. On paper, each invention promised to bend reality, to take the impossible and file it with the U.S. Patent Office as casually as one might file for a new wrench design. Skeptics laughed them off as bureaucratic quirks. Believers saw them as breadcrumbs, evidence that the Navy had been working on something extraordinary for years, hiding it in plain sight. But here's the problem with breadcrumbs. Follow them long enough, and you start to question whether you're on a trail or being led in circles. Every explanation seemed to contradict another. If it was a hypersonic swarm, why the rumors about single-craft sightings? If it was electromagnetic? Propulsion. Why the leaked blueprints showing weapon hardpoints? If it was a psyop, why had multiple sailors reported visual encounters with something that defied conventional flight patterns? Theories clashed, overlapped, merged. Internet sleuths drew sprawling connection maps with arrows crisscrossing between. Patents, military exercises, and obscure budget line items buried in defense appropriations bills. Amateur physics enthusiasts uploaded videos explaining why electromagnetic propulsion was definitely real, followed by others proving it absolutely impossible. Former intelligence officers weighed in on podcasts, each insisting they had it on good authority that the truth was far stranger or far simpler than anyone guessed. In the end, the only thing everyone agreed on was this. Every answer only raised more questions. And then, the video surfaced. Declassified by the Navy just days after the speculation reached fever pitch, it was grainy, shot from the deck of a destroyer during what appeared to be a nighttime training operation. At first, nothing but the rolling black waves. Then flash, a streak across the sky, moving far too fast for a jet, far too controlled for a meteor. The camera tracked it, barely keeping up, until it vanished not into the horizon, but straight upward, as if gravity had suddenly decided it was optional. To some, it was proof of the hypersonic swarm, one member breaking formation. To others, it screamed electromagnetic propulsion, the kind no atmospheric craft should survive. The irony? The clip didn't narrow the theories. It made two of them more plausible. At the same time, the twist didn't come from a press conference or a carefully worded Pentagon memo. It came from a voice hoarse, nervous, and speaking in a dimly lit room to an independent journalist who had built a career on chasing military ghost stories. The man wouldn't give his name, wouldn't show his face, but what he described made the Navy's unstoppable revelation feel almost mum. This tech, he said, leaning closer to the microphone, wasn't tested. Last year, or even 5 years ago. The first full-scale trial happened in 2004, but not here, not in our skies. It was tested in space. The word hung in the air like a slow-rolling thundercloud. Space. Suddenly, the whispered reports of strange energy, signatures detected by astronomical observatories, made sense. For years, unexplained satellite failures had been dismissed as routine malfunctions, fried circuits, micrometeorite strikes, solar flare interference. But the whistleblower claimed that at least some of them had been deliberate, not accidents, demonstrations. The anomalies weren't limited to satellites either. Radar operators stationed on Aegis-equipped destroyers had long told stories over beers in port. City stories about ghost contacts appearing and vanishing over remote stretches of ocean, objects that outran missiles without even accelerating, blips that rose straight out of the sea before disappearing beyond the atmosphere. At the time, these tales were written off as tall ones. Now, they sounded like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to admit existed. What pushed the story into dangerous territory was what came next. The whistleblower paused, as if weighing whether the words could even be spoken without consequence. Then, almost in a whisper, "Not all of it is ours." At first, the interviewer assumed he meant foreign powers, Russia, China, maybe some shadow alliance of allied nations pooling black budget resources. But the man shook his head. "We're not talking about Moscow or Beijing. Parts of this system were recovered, we didn't build them. Copied what we could. Reverse-engineered technology." The phrase was so radioactive it practically sparked in the air. In conspiracy circles, it was the holy grail, the idea that something not human-made had been found, studied, and repurposed for Earth's militaries. Officially, the U.S. government had always denied it. Unofficially, there were stories stretching back decades, crash retrieval teams, sealed hangars in Nevada, classified projects whose budgets could buy small countries. Now, if this whistleblower was telling the truth, the unstoppable weapon was less an invention and more a discovery, and that reframed everything. This wasn't just a leap in human ingenuity. It might have been the culmination of decades spent trying to replicate technology from somewhere else. The odd design choices in the leak schematics suddenly made sense. The curves, the materials that didn't match known aerospace standards, the absence of traditional propulsion systems. If it had been built from scratch, it would have been one of the boldest gambles in military history. If it had been adapted from something recovered, it was something far stranger, a merging of human and non-human engineering, Frankenstein of cosmic proportions. In this new light, the space tests took on a different tone. Perhaps the Navy hadn't just wanted to test the weapon beyond prying eyes. They'd wanted to test it in the same environment where it had been found. Maybe that was why, in the years following these alleged tests, astronomers quietly stopped publishing certain types of deep space telemetry, citing national security requests. Maybe that was why those satellite failures never had official explanations that satisfied engineers. Even the radar anomalies over oceans began to seem less like random sightings and more like rehearsals controlled appearances in unpopulated zones, exercises to gauge how the craft behaved near the boundary between atmosphere and water. The whistleblower's account cracked open a door most people weren't ready to look through. Up until now, the narrative had been about military advantage, about geopolitical strategy. But if this technology wasn't entirely human in origin, then the implications went far beyond deterrence or defense. It raised questions about who or what had first brought it here, about whether it had been given or left behind, about what else might still be out there, watching, waiting, the interviewer voice tight.
Ask the question everyone was thinking. Are you saying?
"This is alien." The man didn't answer directly, just exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Let's just say it's been here longer than we have." And just like that, the frame shifted again. This wasn't a story about the next war. It was a story about something that might have started long before humanity even understood what war was. The whistleblower's testimony ended abruptly after that. The journalist swore he'd been followed for weeks, that his home was searched while he was away. The footage of the interview vanished from his online backup without explanation. But the words remained, and that's when the real secret came out. This weapon isn't new. Been here. For decades, if the whistleblower was right, I think this unstoppable technology had been here for decades, then the future wasn't just a matter of politics or strategy, it was a matter of survival. For the military, the implications were intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. In theory, possession of such a weapon would make the United States untouchable, a fortress no enemy could breach. It could deter war on a scale humanity had never seen, the ultimate trump card in an age of nuclear stalemates. But the same sword that promises peace can also provoke bloodshed. History is filled with examples of empires that overplayed their hand, believing in their invincibility until rivals struck in desperation. If other nations believed the U.S. had leaped decades or even centuries ahead in weapons technology, they wouldn't simply concede. They would scramble to close the gap, no matter the cost. And that's where the nightmare begins. A new arms race wouldn't be about missiles or bombs, it would be about physics itself. Nations would throw resources into reverse engineering their own versions, tearing through environmental and ethical safeguards in the process. The Cold War's space race might look quaint by comparison. Back then, humanity was reaching for the stars. This time, it might be clawing for control over forces it barely understands. Even if this technology never fires a single shot in combat, its existence could distort global politics. Alliances would shift. Treaties would fracture. Intelligence agencies would expand their reach, fueled by paranoia. Leaders might make decisions not on what's true, but on what they suspect the other side is hiding. Beyond geopolitics lies a more unsettling question. What happens if this technology escapes? The vault. The military prides itself on control, but history is littered with examples of weapons slipping into the wrong hands. Arms dealers, rogue states, even private corporations. If an unstoppable craft or weapon could be duplicated, it could just as easily become the tool of a regime willing to use it without restraint. The damage wouldn't just be military, it could be existential. Yet for all its danger, the technology holds an almost irresistible promise. If it can bend physics enough to evade any defense, could it also be adapted for peaceful purposes? Imagine ships traveling between Earth and Mars in weeks instead of months. Imagine portable generators capable of powering entire cities without fuel or emissions. Imagine disaster response vehicles that could reach any corner of the planet in minutes. The same principles that make a weapon unstoppable might make it the key to solving problems that have plagued humanity for centuries. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. Such technology wouldn't just transform warfare and travel. It would transform society itself. Energy monopolies would collapse. Borders might lose their meaning. Entire economies would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. And history tells us that those in power rarely allow such shifts to happen peacefully. The deeper fear is something quieter, harder to put into words. What if this technology wasn't designed to be used at least, not by us? What if it's not a sword but a signal, a preparation, warning? Perhaps it was never meant to win battles between nations, but to face something no nation can fight alone, something coming. And maybe, just maybe, it's already affecting us without our knowledge. Economic tremors, political instability, scientific breakthroughs that seem to leap ahead by decades without explanation. The ripples of an invisible stone dropped into the ocean of history. If that's true, then the future of this technology isn't coming. It's here right now. We're already living in its shadow. It began with a single, strange announcement, a few sentences from the U.S. Navy that should have sunk like a stone into the ocean of bureaucracy, yet instead sent shockwaves across the globe. They told us, with the confidence of a chess master revealing only one move in a match that's already halfway played, that they possess a weapon nothing on Earth can stop. No fanfare, no dramatic press conference, just a quiet ripple. That grew into a tidal wave of speculation. But why now? I reveal even a sliver of something so monumental. If history teaches us anything, it's that militaries rarely speak unless it serves a purpose. Maybe this was a calculated warning to rivals. Maybe it was a controlled leak to prepare the public for a truth too large to drop all at once. Maybe it was a misdirection, drawing our eyes to one hand while the other moves unseen in the shadows. For every answer we've chased, we've stumbled into a dozen more questions. The timelines don't match, the physics don't match, testimonies don't match. And yet, certainty in their words remains like a locked door in the middle of an empty field, impossible to ignore, impossible to open. If it's real, then humanity has stepped into a new era, one where unstoppable forces aren't just the stuff of myth or nature, but forged in steel, circuitry, and secrets. We've always lived with such forces: hurricanes, earthquakes, the relentless march of time. We've learned to respect them, to adapt to them, sometimes even to outwit them.
Outwit.
This is different, because for the first time we might be the ones creating the storm. Picture it, a silent Navy vessel cutting through gray waters, its hull slick with mist, its decks empty but for the shadows of crew who don't speak of what they've seen. Somewhere deep within, locked behind layers of steel and silence, it carries something the world is not ready for. No sound escapes it, no light escapes it. Only the knowledge that it exists, and that nothing, no missile, no machine, no government can stop it. And if the Navy is willing to admit this much, what are they still keeping from us?